I didn't leave my life in a dramatic way. There was no slammed door, no final argument, no last message that sounded like a goodbye. I stayed. And that was the problem. I stayed so long that one morning I woke up and realized I couldn't tell where my life ended and someone else's expectations began. That realization didn't come with tears or panic. It came quietly, like a sentence whispered in a room you thought was empty. You don't belong here anymore. For years, I told myself that staying was the responsible thing. Responsible people don't run. Responsible people endure. They fix things. They compromise. They wait. I became very good at waiting. Waiting for the right moment, the right mood, the right version of myself that would suddenly know what to do. I waited through birthdays that felt borrowed, through conversations where I nodded at the right moments without really listening, through evenings where I sat in the same chair and felt time moving past me like traffic I could no longer join. I had a life that looked complete from the outside. A routine. A place to be. People who expected me to show up as the version of myself they were used to. Nothing was technically wrong, which made it harder to explain why everything felt wrong. I learned early that vague unhappiness is harder to defend than visible pain. If you're bleeding, people understand. If you're just quietly disappearing, they call it a phase. I remember the exact moment I realized how far gone I was. It was an ordinary morning. I was brushing my teeth, staring at my reflection, when I tried to imagine my future. Not a dream future. Just next year. And my mind went blank. No image, no feeling, no resistance or excitement. Just emptiness. That scared me more than any worst-case scenario ever could. Fear means you still care. Emptiness means you've already started letting go. I didn't tell anyone. I became an expert at hiding internal collapses. I smiled at the right times. I answered questions with rehearsed phrases. I learned that most people don't really want honesty, they want reassurance that nothing is changing. And I gave it to them, even as something inside me kept asking a question I refused to answer. How long do you plan to stay like this? The truth is, I stayed because leaving felt like betrayal. Betrayal of people who counted on me, of choices I had defended for years, of a version of myself I had worked hard to become. Walking away would mean admitting that my patience wasn't noble, that my endurance wasn't strength, that all those years weren't building towards something better. They were just years. At night, when the world got quiet enough to hear myself think, I replayed old moments. The first time I ignored a warning sign because it was inconvenient. The first time I said yes when my body was already saying no. The first time I laughed at a joke that made me uncomfortable just to keep the peace. Those moments didn't feel important back then, they were small decisions, polite decisions. But they accumulated. And slowly, without noticing, I trained myself to disappear. I started feeling like a guest in my own life. Everything functioned without my presence. I could be replaced in conversations, in routines, in memories. Some days I tested this idea quietly. I stayed silent longer than usual. I cancelled plans. I stopped offering opinions. Nothing collapsed. The world adjusted. That hurt more than I expected. There's a particular kind of grief that comes from realizing your absence wouldn't be noticed. It's not dramatic. It's heavy and dull, like carrying a stone in your chest. I told myself that this was adulthood, that everyone eventually feels this way, that meaning is something you outgrow like childhood fantasies. But deep down, I knew I was lying. I wasn't growing up. I was shrinking. I began to envy strangers. Not their lives, but their anonymity. The idea of being unknown started to feel like relief instead of loneliness. I imagined waking up in a place where no one expected anything from me, where my past didn't introduce me before I could speak. I told myself these were just thoughts, harmless mental escapes. But thoughts have weight. And the more I carried them, the heavier staying became. The breaking point didn't arrive with fireworks. It arrived with exhaustion. One evening, after another day that felt exactly like all the others, I sat alone and realized I was tired of explaining myself to myself. Tired of justifying why tomorrow would somehow be different when I knew I would make the same choices. Tired of surviving a life I no longer wanted to participate in. That night, I didn't make a plan. I made a decision. And the decision wasn't I will leave. It was simpler and more terrifying. I will stop pretending that staying is saving anyone. Especially me. I didn't sleep much after that. My mind kept racing ahead, imagining consequences, reactions, damage. But beneath all that noise was something steady and unfamiliar. Clarity. Not confidence. Just clarity. The kind that doesn't ask for permission. By morning, nothing had changed. The world looked the same. But I didn't. And for the first time in years, that difference felt like the beginning of something instead of the end. Once the decision settled inside me, everything I had been ignoring became louder. The walls of my life didn't change, but I suddenly felt how narrow the room was. Every routine felt like a question I could no longer avoid answering. Why this path? Why these people? Why this version of me? I realized how much energy I had spent convincing myself that discomfort was normal, that dissatisfaction was maturity, that silence was peace. I started noticing how often I said it's fine when it wasn't. How often I postponed my own needs because someone else's expectations felt heavier. I had confused loyalty with self-erasure, patience with fear, stability with paralysis, and the worst part was that no one had forced me into this life. I had built it myself, choice by choice, compromise by compromise. That's when guilt entered the picture. Not the loud kind that screams at you, but the quiet, persuasive kind that speaks in familiar voices. You owe them. You can't just disappear. You made promises. I replayed imagined conversations in my head, trying to prepare defenses I would never actually use. Because deep down, I knew explanations wouldn't help. No explanation sounds reasonable to someone who benefits from you staying. I didn't want to hurt anyone. That was the sentence I repeated to myself whenever doubt crept in. But slowly, painfully, I understood something else. By staying, I was already hurting myself. And the longer I stayed, the more resentful I became. Resentment is quiet at first. Then it starts leaking into your tone, your patience, your kindness. I didn't want to become bitter. I didn't want to blame others for a life I had chosen to endure. So I began preparing in silence. Not dramatically. No lists pinned to walls, no countdowns. I reduced my life instead. I stopped buying things I didn't care about. I gave away objects that carried memories I no longer wanted to carry. Each small act felt like loosening a knot. I learned how little I actually needed when I stopped trying to look complete. People noticed changes, of course. They always do when you stop performing. They asked if I was tired, if something was wrong, if I needed a vacation. I smiled and gave them easy answers. The truth felt too large to share, too fragile. I was afraid that if I spoke it out loud, someone would convince me to stay again. There were nights when I almost gave up on the idea entirely. Nights when loneliness wrapped itself around me and whispered that this was as good as it gets. That starting over is a fantasy for braver people. That disappearing doesn't make you free, it just makes you irresponsible. I lay awake staring at the ceiling, bargaining with myself. Maybe I can endure a little longer. Maybe it will pass. But every morning, the same emptiness greeted me. Calm, patient, undeniable. It wasn't dramatic sadness. It was absence. And absence doesn't heal with time. It just grows more familiar. The day I finally left was almost insultingly ordinary. No one sensed anything. I followed my routine like muscle memory. I said the right words. I moved through familiar spaces knowing it would be the last time. That knowledge didn't make me nostalgic. It made me honest. I saw things clearly, without attachment. The place had never been home. It had just been where I stayed. I packed a small bag. Not because I wanted to travel light, but because I didn't trust myself not to bring pieces of my old life with me if I allowed more space. I didn't want souvenirs of the person I had been pretending to be. I wanted emptiness. Room to breathe. Leaving without explanation felt cruel at first, but then I realized explanations are often just attempts to ease our own discomfort. I wasn't disappearing to punish anyone. I was disappearing because I needed a chance to exist without being interpreted. When I stepped outside, the world didn't react. Cars passed. People talked. The sky didn't darken or open up. And yet, with every step away, something inside me loosened. Fear was still there, of course. But underneath it was relief. Raw, trembling relief. For the first time in years, I didn't know who I was supposed to be tomorrow. And instead of panic, I felt possibility. I didn't know where I was going. I only knew where I wasn't going back to. And that was enough to keep moving. Disappearing doesn't feel like freedom right away. It feels like falling without knowing if there's ground below you. The first days were quiet in a way I wasn't prepared for. Not peaceful. Empty. When you remove yourself from a life that has defined you for years, silence rushes in to take its place. There was no one to check in with, no one to confirm that I was doing the right thing. Just me and the consequences of my choice. I expected regret to come immediately. A sharp wave of panic, a desperate urge to go back and undo everything. It didn't. What came instead was grief. Grief for the years I had spent becoming someone I never meant to be. Grief for the version of myself that once believed endurance would be rewarded. I mourned quietly, without drama, without witnesses. Some losses don't need an audience. There were moments when fear returned with force. Standing in unfamiliar places, surrounded by people who didn't know my name or my history, I felt small and exposed. Anonymity was comforting in theory. In practice, it stripped away every excuse. Without a past to hide behind, I had no one to blame for my next step. Freedom, I learned, is heavy. I started noticing how deeply my old life had trained me. I apologized too often. I hesitated before speaking. I waited for permission that never came. Even alone, I carried invisible rules with me. It took time to recognize them, and longer to unlearn them. Starting over isn't about changing your surroundings. It's about dismantling the internal structure you built to survive where you no longer live. Some nights, doubt crept in quietly. I would replay memories, wondering if I had exaggerated my unhappiness, if I had mistaken restlessness for truth. It's tempting to romanticize the familiar when the present feels uncertain. But each time that happened, I returned to one simple fact. I could breathe again. Not deeply. Not easily. But honestly. I didn't rebuild my life in a dramatic way. There was no sudden transformation, no cinematic redemption. Just small choices made without negotiation. I chose what to eat based on hunger, not habit. I chose silence when I didn't want to speak. I chose movement when stillness felt like hiding. These choices seemed insignificant, but together they formed something fragile and real, ownership. I learned that meaning doesn't arrive fully formed. It grows slowly, like trust. It asks for patience, but not the kind that erases you. The kind that allows you to stay present while becoming someone new. I stopped measuring my worth by how useful I was to others. I stopped apologizing for needing space. I stopped explaining my absence. There is a cost to leaving everything behind. Some bridges burn quietly, without flames or noise, simply because you never walk back across them. There are people who will never understand your silence, and places that will remember you only as a shadow. Accepting that is part of choosing yourself. Not everyone gets closure. Sometimes, freedom is the closure. I still don't have all the answers. I don't know where this path ultimately leads. But I know something I didn't before. Staying would have killed me slowly. Leaving gave me the chance to live honestly, even if that life is smaller, quieter, less impressive from the outside. If there's one truth I carry with me now, it's this. You don't lose yourself all at once. You lose yourself in pieces, every time you choose comfort over truth. And you don't find yourself again in a single brave moment. You find yourself every day you refuse to disappear for someone else's peace. I stayed so long that I forgot who I was. Leaving didn't give me a new identity. It gave me space to remember.